I'd like to welcome everyone to our event today. We have a very special guest. Honored to have Dr. Peter Prys with us. He is the Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. My name is David Pine. I'm the Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force. Dr. Prys he's very accomplished. He's written over a dozen books and on this threat, and he is an expert on EMP effects and the dangers of both man-made and super geomagnetic storms. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Prys.
David, could you give him the mic? Just hand him that mic.
Sure.
Thank you for that introduction, David. Give you a little more background. I've spent my whole professional career working in the national security community, first at the CIA, where I was the CIA senior analyst for Soviet and then Russian nuclear weapons and electromagnetic pulse effects and nuclear strategy. Then on the House Armed Services Committee, where I was on the professional staff and served as the subject matter expert for the 60 members of the House Armed Services Committee on weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, EMP, cyber warfare. Then I served on several congressional commissions as a subject matter expert and as a member of the staff. I was the director of the U.S. Nuclear Strategy Forum, and I served for 17 years as the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission. And a little background on what is a commission. Most Americans don't know what commissions are, but presidential and congressional commissions are scientific technical bodies that are formed to provide public policy advice to Congress and the White House on that is definitive for purposes of public policy. What is the threat? Is the threat from cyber warfare or advanced biological weapons or nuclear or missiles that are proliferating to Iran and North Korea, or electromagnetic pulse? Are these real threats? How serious are the threats? What should we do about them? So commissions play a really crucial, pivotal role, and the process of relying on commissions for this kind of advice has been very successful. And in fact, usually the commission's recommendations, unfortunately, are not fully implemented, because sometimes Congress and the public, finds it hard to believe that the commissions are that right about the threat is. But the history tends to be that the commissions are spot on in terms of the analysis, because they are the best scientific and strategic brains that the free world has to offer that work on these commissions, and the public policy actions tend to fall short of the mark. They don't go as far as the commissions recommend. So, for example, today we have a national missile defense, that was established as a result of the Marsh Commission, the Rumsfeld Commission, that warned that North Korea and Iran would become national missile threats to us, but we only have 44 ground-based interceptors in the national missile defense. At least we've got something, so it's a step in the right direction. But it falls short of what the Commission recommended, and we should have better, more robust, more effective national missile defenses. We had the Marsh Commission during the Clinton administration warned that computer viruses and cyber warfare would be a wave of the future. And as a consequence of those recommendations, we do have offices of cybersecurity in the White House and in every department and agency of the federal government, and in state governments too, oftentimes right down to the county level. But the response is still not adequate to deal with this threat that a lot of people didn't even believe in at the time the commission made the report. But the threat is here and upon us now, and doing things like shutting down Colonial Pipeline and causing a national security crisis on the East Coast of the United States. The commissions recommended, there was the WMD Commission that warned about future biological warfare threats, exotic biological warfare threats like genetically engineered anthrax that could kill 90% of the population. And enormous amounts of money, billions of dollars were invested, and many decades were invested in trying to prepare for future biological warfare threats. Center for Disease Control, the various hospitals, and yet, and we did take a lot of steps, we took a lot of measures, but when something that was far short of the actual biological threat happened, which is COVID, look how unprepared the country is. But thank God we at least did something. We had something in motion. And now the EMP Commission, which I think is probably the longest lived commission in history. 17 years it existed on and off, trying to educate people and warn the country about this threat, which was known to the Defense Department since the Starfish Prime nuclear test in 1962, but was deeply classified. The existence of an EMP phenomena would leak out in the press every now and then, but the full scale and scope of the threat, was not explained and not understood until the EMP Commission reports came out that were declassified and provided testimony to Congress in 2008, and pointed out that this was perhaps the greatest threat to our electronic civilization, to Western and Eastern and global civilization, because all global civilization is basically an electronic civilization today. We cannot sustain the large populations that we have all around the world without electric grids, communication systems, water systems that use millions and millions of volts of electricity to purify and pump water, the food infrastructures that are needed to harvest and transport and deliver food to, in America, 330 million people on a daily basis. So everybody gets 3 squares a day and doesn't even think about it, about the technological miracle that is, that you can turn on a faucet and get a glass of water. It's a technological miracle, that you can pick up an apple, we actually did a study, picked up an apple from a grocery store in Washington, D.C., and traced its history. Where did this apple come from? It came from Washington State. It was mechanically harvested and cleaned and packaged and shipped across the country in refrigerated trucks, went to a big food distribution center in Maryland, and then was delivered to the shelves of a grocery store in Washington, D.C. Even the humble apple, now its delivery and its consumption depends, upon this vast technological machine that depends upon electricity. And if you take that all away, which EMP can do, you can think of it as an anti-technology weapon that subtracts technology from the equation of your civilization. And we can no more exist as an electronic civilization, as a modern civilization without electricity and the electronic infrastructures than the Romans could without their roads and aqueducts that made classical civilization possible. Now let me briefly describe the 3, EMP threats that we're most concerned about and that the Commission made recommendations to protect against. The first is from the sun. The Mother Nature can make an EMP from a solar superstorm. A coronal mass ejection is thrown out of the sun. It's basically a big chunk of the sun that gets thrown out from the sunspots, which is kind of like an electromagnetic cannon, that black hole on the surface of the sun. It goes into the core of the sun, and a coronal mass ejection, a big chunk of the sun will come out, which is much larger than the Earth, many times larger than the Earth, and it'll be traveling at over 1 million miles per hour to hit the Earth. And this happens all the time, and we do get hit by solar storms every year. Most of them are, run-of-the-mill solar storms that don't affect the United States. Sometimes you'll see an aurora borealis, which is the result of these solar storms. Usually they only affect countries on high northern latitudes, like Canada or Norway and Finland. But every now and then, what we are concerned about is the solar superstorm, like the 1859 Carrington event, which is the most powerful solar superstorm on record. When the Carrington event hit in 1859, telegraph systems, were the cutting edge electronic technology. And telegraph systems were on every continent on the planet except Antarctica. Every place the colonial powers built a railroad, they would string a telegraph line. We had railroad systems and telegraph systems in Australia, Africa, of course all over Europe and North America and South America, in Asia, India, China. And when the Carrington event hit, it basically destroyed the telegraph systems all over the world. And the transatlantic cable had just been laid in 1859, connecting North America to Western Europe. And the pulse was so powerful it reached miles down, deep down into the ocean and burned out that cable. And it took years to relay that cable. Now, civilization didn't end in 1859, because they were not an electronic civilization then. Telegraph was a technological novelty. Most people lived as farmers, and it was the horse and buggy era, and so we were not an electronic civilization. But looking back, what would happen if a Carrington event happened today? Those telegraph systems, if you look at what a telegraph key looked like, it's a big clunky piece of electronics. They were literally a billion times less vulnerable to EMP than our modern microelectronics, which operate on much lower voltages and are much faster. They are billions of times more vulnerable to the EMP effect. If a Carrington event happened today, it would certainly collapse power grids and the life-sustaining critical infrastructures all over the world and put billions of lives at risk. And unlike 1859, we would probably have billions of mortalities, because people would starve to death. The EMP Commission calculated that if we had a nationwide blackout that lasted 1 year, we could lose up to 90% of our population to starvation, disease, and societal collapse. Because people cannot live without food and water. We tried to figure out, how do you sustain a population of 330 million people for a year with no food and water? We only have enough food to feed our population for 30 days, stored in big regional food warehouses, and it will immediately begin to spoil when the lights go out, because the temperature control systems and refrigerators will stop working. And we would have no means of getting the food to where it is needed, especially in the big populous cities, to the grocery stores, which typically only have enough food on their shelves to last about 3 days at normal consumption rates. And there would be no water immediately. And many other bad things would happen in the event of an EMP event from Mother Nature or from man. Things like the gas pipelines would probably spark and explode, so you could end up with firestorms in cities. The nuclear reactors, their batteries will only run for about 7 days, their emergency backup, and so they'll go Fukushima, and you'd have the 100 nuclear reactors in the United States spreading radioactivity, everywhere. But the biggest thing, the thing that would kill most people is the simple old-fashioned starvation and disease, the starvation including the lack of water. So it's a high-tech means of killing people the old-fashioned way, targeting or attacking the electric grid, or from a natural catastrophe like a geomagnetic superstorm. So we've talked about the threat from the sun, the EMP threat from the sun, which is inevitable, by the way. It's rare that these things happen, but NASA calculates that the likelihood of a recurrence of a Carrington event is about 12% per decade. And that virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes, or no later that of our grandchildren, they will experience a Carrington event. So we have to be ready for it. It's inevitable. There's no deterring or reasoning with the sun. It will happen for sure someday. Nuclear EMP attack. In our strategic culture, people think, a nuclear war can't possibly happen. Nuclear deterrence worked all through the Cold War, and therefore, we don't have to worry about a nuclear war. Well, nuclear EMP attack is one of the ways of knocking the props out from under the strategy of mutual assured destruction, because with an EMP attack, you can attack your adversary and remain anonymous so that they don't know who attacked you, especially now when we have the proliferation of nuclear and missile technologies to multiple countries, including Russia, China, North Korea, Pakistan, and India. The one way all EMP attacks, nuclear EMP attacks would work would be the high altitude detonation of a nuclear weapon in outer space. At minimum altitude, it has to be at least 30 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, which puts it on the edge of the atmosphere in outer space. It could be up to 300 or even 500 kilometers to do the EMP attack. The higher you go, the bigger the field gets on the ground. So if you did a burst, an EMP burst, over the center of the United States at an altitude of about 300 kilometers, the field from a single weapon would cover all of North America. And it would put at risk, it would destroy the personal computer on your desk, collapse power grids, cars wouldn't start, airplanes would fall out of the sky. You know, all the electronics in North America would be at risk. Not necessarily all of them would be destroyed, but a substantial percentage of them would be destroyed, enough so that it would end you as an electronic civilization. And the consequences would be catastrophic and unrecoverable. Catastrophic and unrecoverable. And one of the first things to go when you're doing an EMP attack, a nuclear EMP attack, are the radars and the satellites that we rely upon for early warning and to identify who attacked us. It, in effect, at the speed of light, blinds your national technical means for identifying who the adversary is. Who do I have to retaliate against? You know, is it China? Is it Russia? Is it North Korea? Is it some Iranian terrorist group that's been given the bomb by North Korea? You know, you can launch an EMP attack off of a freighter off the coast, or lofted by a balloon can get to 30 kilometers altitude. You could put a nuclear weapon tied to a meteorological balloon and loft it off the east or west coast of the United States and have it timed to go off at some point when it's floated over the continental United States. Really, all you have to do to end us as an electronic civilization is take out the eastern grid. The U.S. electric grid is divided into three parts: the eastern, western, and Texas grids. But the most important part for us is the eastern grid. You know, 75% of our electricity is generated by the eastern grid, and most of our population is sustained by it. And the eastern grid, which is more than the eastern half of the United States, the eastern grid goes to the west of the Mississippi River, runs from the east coast to someplace west of the Mississippi River. And all that population would not be able to live there. And so what would the consequences be for Texas and the people in the far west, in the western grid, you know, having to try to deal with the refugee population from more than the eastern half of the United States, which is likely. So that's a nuclear EMP attack with one weapon. You know, you can make an attack anonymously, which defeats the concept of mutual assured destruction. And it's one of the reasons the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and even the Iranians, who are supposed to not have the bomb yet, but in a 2010 military textbook from Iran, they talk about making a nuclear EMP attack against the United States. I suggest our intelligence community might want to revisit their assessment about where the Iranian nuclear weapons program is when they're writing things like this in their military textbook. And their calculations are scientifically accurate about what they could achieve. So the last dimension of the EMP attack is the non-nuclear EMP threat. You know, you can actually make nuclear or non-nuclear EMP weapons based on design information available on the internet. And when I was on the House Armed Services Committee, we did an experiment. It was the year before 9/11 happened, and there was in Congress, there are committees, you know, which are the most important thing. The House Armed Services Committee. Then there are subcommittees, which have less prestige than a full committee, but they're still, you know, counted as highly prestigious, the subcommittees. And then there are panels, which are the least prestigious part of these committees. And there was a terrorism panel established in the year 2000, because the view of the Congress and the intelligence community was that terrorism in the year 2000 wasn't such a big threat that it deserved a full subcommittee. And so I was one of those staff who was serving on the terrorism panel because we believed that assessment was wrong. Again, this was the year 2000, it was a year before 9/11 happened, and the global war on terrorism came on the scene. We believed that assessment was wrong, and that terrorism was probably going to be the source of the next war. And one of the things we were concerned about is that terrorists might develop non-nuclear EMP weapons, you know? And so we did an experiment where we hired a guy who had a master's degree in electrical engineering, gave him a few students and some money to work with, and said, using only parts that you could purchase at Radio Shack, and using open source design information, see if you can build a non-nuclear EMP weapon. And in less than a year, they built two. And it was a unique hearing we had with the panel. We actually helicoptered the congressional panel and other members of Congress who were very interested that included the late great Floyd Spence, who was the visionary chairman of that committee, who also disagreed that the panel should just be a panel. And we helicoptered them out to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, the U.S. Army Proving Grounds at Aberdeen, because they had a stochastic chamber that contains EMP, so that when you tested a non-nuclear EMP weapon, it wouldn't take down an airliner flying overhead or something like that. And the weapons were demonstrated, and they actually worked. You know, one of them was designed to look like the shipping crate for a Xerox machine. And the idea was, mind you, this was before 9/11, the idea was to mail it to the Pentagon, and it would sit in the mailroom, slowly frying the Pentagon computers. And the other one was designed to fit inside of a Volkswagen bus, and you could drive it down Wall Street and fry the computers on Wall Street and cause a national economic crisis. But there are EMP devices. In one of my books, Blackout Wars, I have the ad for an American Electronics magazine that advertises an EMP suitcase. And it looks just like a metallic suitcase and can be operated by an individual, and it shows the wave form, 100,000 volts per meter, 100,000 volts per meter, out to a range of a few hundred yards. You know, and so you can buy these, and you don't need a license to buy one of these. You know, you need a license to buy a gun, you need a license to drive a car, but this is basically a weapon, but it could be used. The manufacturers don't intend it to be a weapon of mass destruction. I'm sure it was not in the minds of it's designed, it has legitimate industrial uses, this suitcase. You know, for example, when you're designing airports, and you want to know how far the radar should be from the landing strip so that the electromagnetic transients from the radar don't fry the electronics on a landing airliner. You know, it has legitimate uses like that. But you can use this as a weapon. And so in effect, this is a weapon of mass destruction that can be bought for $50,000 by anybody. You know, you can take this, you know, we've arrived at a place in our civilization where terrorists or criminals or a madman who had the money and a little knowledge of the electric grid, you know, could buy one of these devices, put it in the trunk of his car, drive over to an EHV transformer substation of a major metropolitan area, and topple the technological pillars of civilization for a whole city, New York or Boston or Los Angeles or Salt Lake City, and cause the collapse of electronic civilization in that whole area. And if you had a team of terrorists running around the country, taking out EHV transformers, you know, you could cause a protracted nationwide blackout, just like with a nuclear EMP device, except using these non-nuclear devices. And it wouldn't take the destruction of many transformer substations. The U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did a sensitive study. The details are not available to the public, but some of the information was leaked to the Wall Street Journal, and they found that if there were 9 key out of 2,000 EHV transformer substations, if you knew which 9 to attack, you could attack as few as 9 and take down the whole national electric grid. Maybe the terrorists wouldn't be smart enough to figure out which 9, but in my book Blackout Warfare, you know, I calculate that in 24 hours, you know, if you had non-nuclear EMP weapons in a van, you could destroy hundreds of EHV transformers in 24 hours. And so that would surely be enough to bring on the catastrophe. I guess the last thing I'd like to note is we've been talking all about EMP, and that's been the focus of this presentation so far. But the threat is the most serious threat. But there are other threats to the electric grid, to the national grid, that we don't have time to talk about here today. But they're all described in my book, Blackout Warfare, you know, and which is this is the first book of its kind that's been written in the West. And what it describes is this revolutionary new way of warfare that the Russians and Chinese and North Koreans and Iranians write about in their military doctrine. They think it's the most decisive revolution in military warfare in history. And what it does, it's all focused on attacking national electric grids as a means of winning World War III. And it employs cyber attacks, physical sabotage, guys running around with rocket-propelled grenade launchers and rifles to attack EHV transformer substations, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and the ultimate cyber weapon in their doctrine is a nuclear EMP attack. They don't consider that a form of nuclear warfare. It's considered a form of cyber warfare because it doesn't have any of the other effects of a nuclear weapon. No blast, no radiation, no fallout, just the EMP, which passes harmlessly through people's bodies, but by destroying the electronic civilization, would kill far more people in the long run than a nuclear weapon detonated in a city like a Hiroshima or Nagasaki type scenario. They plan to, any one of these threats, cyber attacks, physical sabotage, non-nuclear EMP or nuclear EMP, any one of them could result in the collapse of the electric grid and a victory in World War III. But like all conservative military planners, they believe in redundancy and the synergistic effects of combining all of these things, sort of like a blitzkrieg in the electromagnetic spectrum. The way the Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg combined armored forces with mobile infantry and artillery and air power to have the synergistic effects that enabled them to almost conquer the world, certainly to conquer Western Europe in a lightning war that shocked the West and nearly resulted in their victory in World War II. Same thing here, except by making this attack, this blitzkrieg in the electromagnetic spectrum, in their doctrine, they could prevail in World War III in 24 hours, and they would not have to fight the US Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, because they would be neutralized. You're not, 99% of the electricity to our military forces that project power comes from the civilian electric grid. And so they wouldn't have to fight them. That's their plan. That's what they intend to do. We see the tip of the spear already being experimented with in things like the Colonial Pipeline incident and other attacks on US critical infrastructures from Russia that happened in the course of this summer. So we need to be prepared for this. Unfortunately, the federal government isn't doing enough, just like with those other threats described by the other commissions. They're doing some things, but again, they're far behind. They're far behind and not doing enough. No electric grid in the United States has been hardened against EMP or cyber warfare or physical sabotage threats. Mostly what we've got are studies, endlessly studying the problem. We have an executive order from the White House that says that the federal government should be moving out to protect all our critical infrastructures. That was from President Trump, and President Biden, to his credit, has continued that executive order. We have the Congress on a bipartisan basis. Democrats and Republicans alike came together in the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act and said, yeah, we agree with this executive order, and we're giving it the force of law. And so you, federal government, need to go forth and protect our electric grids and other civilian critical infrastructures. And we have the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act that requires the Department of Homeland Security to be working with utilities to make pilot projects to protect the grid that hopefully would quickly result in at least that was the intention of the law. The quick protection of our critical infrastructures was the intention of these laws and the intention of the executive orders. But we live in the America I grew up in, it would have happened already, because back in the America I grew up in, when Congress passed a law, the federal government had to obey it and follow it. And when a president issued an executive order, the federal government had to obey it and follow it. But we live at a time in the time of the deep state, when the federal bureaucracy appears to have a mind of its own, does have a mind of its own, and it thinks it knows more, or it thinks it can ignore presidents and Congresses, and does. And that is one of the chief obstacles to our getting protected, And I've described that too in other books, like my book, The Power and the Light, that actually names the names of those who are the chief impediments to getting our country protected. But don't feel despair, we shouldn't wait for Washington. Individual states like Utah or Texas or Maine, you can protect the grids. Governors and state legislatures can protect their own assets. Individual communities can be prepared for an EMP. And we as individuals, can hearken back to our pioneer roots and be prepared as individuals, which is the kind of American that the founders had in mind. Americans who believe in rugged individualism and self-sufficiency and not trusting government, not counting on government to protect the families, being your own first line of defense. That can be done. And that should be done. But thank you so much for hearing me out today. And I am open to questions.